So I just want to now hand you over to Naomi Fowler, a colleague who's the producer of our podcast, The Taxcast, and I'll leave it over to Naomi to introduce you to the next panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to this panel, the panel called Reparations in Action. We're going to keep this as practical as we can. We've got some fantastic speakers who've been working in incredible ways in this area, so I'm looking forward to hearing from them. We're going to focus on how reparations can work in practice in different contexts. And given that we don't have leadership in terms of government leadership on slavery in the nations that need to own their crimes against humanity and genocide, I hope we can also talk about how we can work around that lack of leadership. And also a big question for me is, how do we best work together? How do we best act to support leaders working for reparational justice? How do we give our support to the movement in ways that make sure it's led and shaped by the communities of people that have been wronged and are still being wronged? If we take the example of the UK, we've seen this huge pushback by establishment figures, a real fight over truth itself, a fight against acknowledging our crimes against humanity and the roots of British wealth through slavery and empire. We've had all sorts of toxic things going on in the UK with the group of MPs called the Common Sense Group, fighting all sorts of so-called culture wars, bullying people and organisations trying to act on the historical evidence that we know who are being threatened in all types of ways, people working to stop education in schools on Britain's crimes, the same things happening in the US and elsewhere, and real campaigns of harassment and hate directed at the reparations movement. So the resistance to the reparations movement is really toxic. And talking and campaigning about reparations also means, of course, that we need to talk about ongoing wealth extraction through our second empires. It means talking about our destructive global economic system that's still extracting opportunity and basic well-being and security from people today. It means we have to talk about how we're going to address that practically, how we're going to heal it. And this refusal to face the truth over slavery is not only repeating the trauma, it's perpetuating a kind of sickness in our societies that's never had any medicine. And there's a psychological disconnect and an unwellness that comes from that, and a deadness of new ideas and vision in mainstream politics. As I say, at the heart of that is a global economic system that's rotten to the core. Just quickly before we kick off, I want to tell you about some ongoing work that we're doing at the Tax Justice Network on the City of London financial institutions who we'd like to see do a slavery money audit and eventually an empire money audit. I'm coordinating some research based on Britain's slave owners compensation loan, which many of you will know was only settled on behalf of taxpayers in 2015. And while there's been incredible work by the University of Central London with their Legacies of British Slavery project on the people who received that compensation, the slave owners, we're interested at the Tax Justice Network in identifying the financial institutions that profited from that loan right up until 2015. So we're working with an economic historian, an investigative journalist and some volunteers on that, hopefully eventually some lawyers. And we've been firing off freedom of information requests and looking in archives, hopefully getting closer to our goal. The Bank of England is a particular focus for us at the moment. We know slavery couldn't have happened without the City of London's financial institutions, and there's so much work for us all to do in getting our financial institutions to take responsibility and atone. We know how change comes from the bottom up, never from the top. And despite the lack of government leadership that I mentioned, there are some absolutely brilliant creative leaders working to make reparational justice happen. So for your questions, please put them into the Q&A chat, and we'll try to work through them as we can in the time we have. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Esther Stanford-Xosei is a reparationist and historian of the international social movement for African reparations within and beyond the UK. And just one of the many things she's been working towards is the establishment of the UK All-Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, and initiating cross-party motions on atonement and reparations for African enslavement, which have now been passed by several councils in England. So Esther, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me or hear me well. Thank you to Tax Justice Network for inviting me to say a few words, and I'll get right on with it. So I guess I wanted to start by saying that as a reparationist now of about 20 years standing, this movement for repair, which I'm part of, which is called the International Social Movement for African Reparations, has a long history in the UK. It goes back to the mid-1700s. And in each generation of African people of African descent, we have been organizing to effect and secure holistic forms of reparatory justice. So reparations then are understood to be about people's law, about a people's democracy. They're about a restoration and healing of a real people. And some of the concern that we have in some of these discussions that take place around reparations is that the people are often missing. So it's in terms of my practical work, the work that I'm involved in under the auspices of PARCO, the Pan-Afrikan Reparations Coalition in Europe, is about educating and raising awareness and social movement building. And in particular, raising awareness about the actual leaders of the past and in the present of this movement, the International Social Movement for African Reparations, that we refer to by acronym as the ISMA. As a colleague of ours, Professor Chris Manjapra, says, reparations work itself is a way of life. And he says that belongs to the Black community. So my particular work focuses on three main areas: geopolitics, education, and political economy. In terms of geopolitics, you've already alluded, Naomi, to some of the activism that we're doing under the auspices of the Stop the Mangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. And that is really a campaign that is seeking to get accountability for the continuing crimes of what we refer to as the Mangamizi, a Kiswahili term meaning African Holocaust and continuum of chattel, colonial and neo-colonial forms of enslavement. One of our UK kind of, projects is around establishing the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, which is not like any of the up to 100 truth commissions that have already happened. Since the beginning of chattel enslavement, African people have been denied a hearing, our right to be heard on what the problems are and the work that we are doing to bring about the repair. So there's a huge amount of repair already going on that is not being supported, not being resourced. And part of this commission is about that, as well as, of course, helping to, uncover the history and rewrite the history and atone for the wrongs in very material ways. That work with the Green Party is connected to our own work as African heritage communities to restore ourselves and bring about political governance and structures where we can represent our own interests, so that we're no longer spoken about, but we are actually at the table self-determining solutions. And one of the injuries of the Maangamizi has been the denial of African self-determination and social and civil death. So we're not even recognized as being a people. We're referred to by all these acronyms of BME and all these strange terms that deny our identity and our culture and our heritage and our right to our resources of today. So the Global African People's Parliament is working to represent African heritage communities for national self-determination. It's an international structure, and it works with structures in Africa that are doing the same thing, because on the continent we have a similar problem in that many of the borders there are still maintaining the 1884-1885 Berlin Consensus. So we're working with Ma'atu Buntu Mitawo, Global African Family Reunion International Council, that is promoting what's known as rematriation, which is that long-standing desire that African people have had to return physically, but also culturally and spiritually to our homeland, a right to belong, a right to exercise a global Pan-African citizenship. So that's what's happening in that arena. Under education, a large part of our work is obviously educating about the heritage of reparations struggle, but also seeking to challenge academics, establishment academics around the knowledge production and research that's coming out on reparations. So as PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, we co-founded with scholars at the University of Edinburgh and also the University of Boston, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And we've come up with principles of participation that we are encouraging all educational institutions and other institutions to support, which speaks about the ethics of knowledge production and reparations research when you are dealing with live communities. So nothing about us without us. Anything about us without us is against us, as far as we're concerned. That also entails supporting the development of alternative community educational institutions that promote the true knowledges of African heritage communities on the continent and in the diaspora. So we've established institutions such as what's called PIFICAL, which is promoting internationalist lifelong learning. And we're also working as part of what's called the Gaia House of People to People's Internationalist Solidarity. On the education front, we're also practically involved in developing a reparations archive, particularly archiving the activities of reparations organisers here in the UK, because apart from the Bernie Grant archives, there isn't a resource that researchers can go to find out what the movement has been doing from the mid-1700s right up until the present. And that's being done with the support of the Maangamizi Educational Trust. Finally, in terms of political economy, working with the Global African People's Parliament, communities of African heritage are not waiting to be repaired. You know, our survival, imperatives mean that we have to be repairing ourselves. We have to be making those links with our home countries and trying to do what we can by ourselves, even though we don't have access to our resources to do them as effectively as we would like. And part of that work is about the development of what we refer to as an African heritage community for national self-determination, a Ma'atu Buntu Jama that is connected to similar communities on the continent of Africa referred to as Sankofa Homes. And it's about developing a political economy amongst us in terms of our continued struggle for African liberation. And that is largely about promoting cooperative economics and also looking at solutions in terms of repair that are connected to developing cooperatives and also in terms of land trusts, because we need access to land to be able to try and build communities, sustain communities, grow our own food, do all the things that communities need to do in order to kind of not only survive, but support themselves. So those are some of the key areas that we're working on. So it's promoting other notions of reparations that are not just focused on financial compensation and where money went. It's about recognizing that reparations are ultimately about the restoration of the agency of a people that have been grievously injured and up until this day have not been effectively repaired and not been heard on how we define reparations, how we see it, and what we propose should be done. So those are large parts of the work. Finally, it's also about making those links with other global justice movements and promoting paradigms that can bring other peoples on board and catalyze the repair processes of other people who have also experienced enslavement, colonization, neo-colonization, and their attendant legacies. So the work in the ISMA, the International Social Movement for African Reparations, is also part of a wider internationalist movement called the PRIM, the People's Reparations International Movement, where we are linking with and supporting and helping to catalyze reparation struggles of Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples, Asian communities, so that we can build that critical mass to actually implement the structural changes that we need to implement locally, nationally, and internationally. Those are some of the things that we are working on.
Thank you, Esther. That was a whole series of really, really powerful points, and there's a lot to think about. I'm going to move on to Reverend Dr. Peter Crutchley from the Council for World Mission, who's going to speak to us about the reparations journey of the Council for World Mission, or CWM for short, with their Legacies of Slavery project. The Council for World Mission is formerly the London Missionary Society, and I'm sure Peter will tell you a bit more about that. I had the pleasure of speaking with Peter about this experience and the journey that they're on in the TaxCast episode 105. So you'll always be able to listen to in more detail about that project. But I'll hand you over now to Dr. Reverend Peter Crutchley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you for this invitation, both to come and share some of our work, and especially for the opportunity to hear Esther speak now. That was very powerful, and I'm very grateful, and hope there's things that we can do from my organisation with the things that Esther and Parker are leading and sharing. So I was asked to share something with you about our work in recent times, so I'll very quickly share screen just a little bit, and then I'll go and speak from here. I work for Council for World Mission. We're a global Christian mission organization. We have 32 member churches in 40 different countries around the world, but with a historic root in the London Missionary Society, of whom I'll say a little more in a moment. And we've been working on this project since 2017. So this is to share with you part of our story and our history. This is William Hanke. He was the treasurer of the London Missionary Society, and he was the banker. We were formed in 1795, so this is actually formed just within the shadow of the Bank of England at a meeting at Change Alley in the City of London. And Hanke had a bank, and the Hanke Bank was the bank for the London Missionary Society as well. And he was our treasurer, a trustee, director. He appears in the archives of the Parliamentary Select Committee on abolition of enslavement, in 1832. And he was asked this question: has the result of your experience as treasurer of the society, for which we mean the London Missionary Society, led you to the conclusion from the progress of civilization among the slaves that when instructed they have become more obedient and tranquil? This is Hanke's reply. Quite so. I believe their value, even in the market, has risen in proportion as they have been so instructed. We have had instances of that. The slave has been regarded as more valuable in consequence of his being instructed by the missionaries of our own and other societies. I don't think people need to be reminded what this means, and this statement, this horrific statement about the market and what that is. And who we are talking about in our story, William Hanke, was particularly concerned about the market because he owned the Arcadia plantation in Trelawney in Jamaica, where 300 enslaved Africans were forced to work. And Esther's mentioned already the work of UCL and others on legacies of slavery, and you can discover that William Hanke, after emancipation, actually made an application for over £1 million in compensation in 2019 terms. He only received the equivalent of £520,000. So this is to share with you our shame, but also our outrage. So I want to stop showing you William Hanke. It's bad enough they've got to look at me. And I'm going to share with you on from here then something of our work and our approach. So yes, we've been working on this since 2017, reflecting, responding to our history. We were formed in 1795, so our roots and our origins are in the system rooted in the transatlantic slave trade, in the triangle of that, in the City of London. And our archival work so far has revealed our complicity in the intellectual, colonial, political and spiritual justifications of the sin of enslavement and the racism which has grown from it. Now I should tell you that Council for Mission went through significant changes in 1977. The Eurocentric white-dominated mission model was dismantled officially in 77, so we are now an international organisation founded in the decolonising principles of the 1960s. So we're confronting a complex past from a hybrid present. So our leadership is not white-dominated, even though I come to you as a white person leading at one level this project. But our General Secretary is from Jamaica and our Moderator from Zimbabwe. So we are wrestling with a past that has created us and wondering how to speak to that past, especially. But the project is not portraying legacies as past, but deeply present in inequities we all know and can recognize today. So in this way, Sidon's Legacies project is asking, why are we racist today? Why is racism so endemic today? And how has empire now built on empire in the past? And the answers emerging from our hearings and our work are telling us, because of the ways white people, white institutions, and white nations have imagined, practiced, justified, and codified a global system built on white supremacy, manifest in political economic features like enslavement, colonization, and capitalism, and because of white intellectual and cultural models like education and faith and evangelism. So I'll show you a little bit of what we've done and how we've approached this. We devised 4 hearings that took place in 2017 and 2018. They took place in the UK, in Ghana, in Jamaica, and in the US. And each hearing focused, if you like, on truth-telling, on naming the contemporary and historic legacies of slavery in those locations. And within that, made space for the expressions of lament and pain and outrage, and the considering of action And this brought together a series of reflections and recommendations that was brought into a report which the board of directors of CWM accepted back in 2018, which has 30 calls for action grouped around 8 areas. There's a call for an apology, there's call for reparation, there's call for action on white privilege, there's call for the promotion of black cultures and power, there's call for theologies, missiologies and methodologies which amend for our colonial past. There's call for programmatic development of the legacies of slavery findings, and there's calls for further study and for engagement in this, and of course calls for others to join and for us to seek to extend this work alongside others. And the project continues to trace historic and contemporary legacies, to advocate the work we have begun, and this way we bring together archival research and contemporary critique. We've developed plans for reparation and repentance we are currently about to embrace, alongside a strategy for the outworking of this for the next 7 years, which would be overseen by an independent board. And that legacy strategy and its vision of reparation is carried, if you like, around 3 principal commitments. First of all, resourcing reparatory renewal in communities. And we are proposing this would be in 3 locations: in Guyana, and which is the only community in the Caribbean that the London Missionary Society was in prior to emancipation, and in South Africa, which is one of the earliest nations to which LMS missionaries went, and also within the UK. And that the vision and practice of that reparatory renewal will be identified from within those communities, but enable us, we hope, to work on things like poverty reduction, but also on education and platforms for Black intellectual, cultural, artistic and theological expression. And also then to develop this around a further commitment around resourcing member church certainly, but also wider partner engagement in racial justice and reparatory work, including legal action funds. We recognise that the sin of enslavement and the racism which has manifested itself out of that fundamentally dismantles the legal rights of African descendant and African people, and therefore part of our reparatory commitment should be to seek ways to enable legal redress or legal action. And then the further part of that is to consider how we deliver both further work within our CWM program, but also how we address our own work, life and culture. And there is always a question whether anybody who is engaged in mission or evangelism from any faith perspective can be trusted to not be colonizing. And I take that point completely. And that's part of our task then, of course. So where we've reached. Well, we are committed to reparation and to making racial justice a key part of our work across the next 7 years, and a key part to that has been an agreement to relinquish £10 million to enable this over the coming period. And we're working on how this can be structured in ways that are effective and bring change. The work we've begun in our little place is connecting up with the issues especially that are being raised around the world in other global church spaces. And we're hoping in that respect then in other, as we call, ecumenical spaces where Christian movements gather to bring issues around racial justice and reparation into those spaces. We've already made this a clear part, as you will have heard in the tax podcast, and this is relevant to this meeting, in terms of work we do with the World Council of Churches and the World Communion of Reformed Churches and the Lutheran World Federation on economic justice, where we're making reparations a key part in there through an idea we have, a model we have called the Zacchaeus tax. And we're also trying to advocate within our member churches and seeing some of our member churches in the UK and in Europe beginning to bring this forward into their own life and work, and how they are, as individual churches, going to address this, because we are speaking only about a specific organization, a Christian organization with other independent churches as part of it. And so that some of those churches are indeed asking how they can address this and to become consciously anti-racist and to work on their own histories and legacies in that kind of way. So we're trying to mix academic and activism together. We're already developing research projects that bring, especially, and interested to hear what Esther was saying a moment ago, but especially bringing Black-led scholarship into the archive to work on our materials. We also focusing, especially at the moment, on children and racism. Our archive is filled with signs of how children were used both to raise money, as always in the charity sector, but also as targets of this racist ideology, being given stories that fill them as white children with visions of their, power and supremacy and cultural privilege and so on. We're also trying to develop artistic work, and we're working with the University of the West Indies and the Mona campus in Kingston, Jamaica, to develop community arts work. We're addressing the question of whiteness and working on a long-term program about being white when Black Lives Matters, both in the UK, within Europe, but in triangulating that into our other member church contexts, which is also leading us to build this into other spaces. So we are moving to explore this in the Pacific, which is another area, of course, for us where there is a remaining white dominant leadership, let's say, and also with histories of enslavement through blackbirding, but also things like the racist violence that you see in nuclear testing. So these are all areas that we are trying to spill out into and devise and develop further. So I want to close. I was asked to, kind of maybe even to name in practice some of the issues that we've inevitably meeting and are dealing with. And I think within the vision of reparation, a key learning space for us that's been very clear from those who've engaged with us is that this needs to be relinquishment. We are seeing projects who are naming themselves as offering reparation, but what they're really doing is giving money away to be spent in their own shop. So these resources, such as we can make them, have to be, we have to let go of them. They cannot come back to us. They cannot be roundabout returned to us in other ways. So that's been a key piece in the struggle to kind of address how does this truth-telling, shall we say, become truth-doing. It will not surprise anybody here to recognize that the issues around identity, history, and story are difficult and painful. They're difficult and painful because white identity is slippery, it's duplicitous, and it's usually unconscious. So dealing with some of those questions, is often difficult to bring forward, as is the realization and reality that Black experience is complex, and solidarity, even within African and African descendant peoples, is not to be assumed. So these are painful conversations to be sharing in. So in that sense, I think, is to understand, at least from our perspective, and maybe that's possible as a faith organization, is that we see this within a framework of relationship, within a movement that already has used language about mutual commitment. So in order to live through this together, we keep trying to keep hold of this sense that we are at different locations in this history and we are situated differently, but it is our history, and therefore we do need to own it in order to address the present we seek to dismantle. And it is within this space, I think, that we're trying to understand this is not about the financing of blame, but the resourcing of transformation. It is about dismantling systemic injustice and inequality. And in that sense, it is about the renewal of a community that yearns to be free of that sin and embrace the possibility of being advocates for change. So I'll stop there, and thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts so far.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to move on quickly to Keval Bharadia, who's had a career in the London Stock Exchange for many years, and he's going to be speaking about evolving the financial transactions tax as a reparations tax with fundamental systems change at the heart of it. So not just a way to raise revenue, but you know, to be finding ways to dismantle and disrupt the current global economic system. Keval, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Can you see my slide there?
Yep.
This is a continuation of a presentation I gave at an earlier panel, but these are the best bits. These are the last 3 slides, I think. So I'll be able to get through them quite quickly. I do hope that a lot of the people on the call were already dialed into the panel preceding this one to get to the sort of background that I was giving about the origins of the financial transactions tax. And I hope that what I'm about to do here doesn't seem too jarring for people. So I wrote a paper for the TGN conference that will be available on the website, I believe, on Monday, called Recalibrating Financial Transaction Tax Policy Narratives to Provide a Pathway Towards Reparations. And for the first few slides, I had talked about where it came from and how the discourse and the narratives that had been used for the tax thus far for the last, I think, nearly 80 years have very much been embedded within a liberal, neoclassical, Keynesian economic framework that essentially assured the maintenance of the status quo and was really about trying to make the ills of capitalism less severe. There was no revolutionary change going on in those spaces, and that actually can be traced all the way up to present day, including 2019, when the UK Labour Party put in their excellent manifesto a financial transactions tax. It was still embedded within making London, for example, a citadel of long-term finance, sort of romanticizing empire, perhaps. And that was done through the work of Stamp Out Poverty, which is a UK NGO that markets the financial transactions tax as a Robin Hood tax. So the first part of my presentation dealt with how it could be recalibrated with a narrative that meets a reparations and systems change agenda. This part of the presentation, I'll talk about how it could operate. And I think a reparations tax collected by a transparent, grassroots-led, independent and public organization could help direct funds to those people. Who are they? They are the people, tribes, indigenous communities, movements and societies who are descendants of enslaved people and those ravaged by colonialism. The tax cannot be used to further liberal or neoliberal orthodoxy. It must not fund, wherever they exist, governments, state apparatus and organizations who wish to remedy capital. It cannot go towards financing neo-colonial countries in the global south, as this would result in the maintenance of the status quo. The tax could finance the building of consultation processes, inquiries, and bodies in line with demands these movements have been making for centuries. It would finance the building of a polity that values socialism over capitalism and values democracy over fascism and plutocracy. The free movement of international capital needs to be disrupted and dismantled as part of a reparations agenda. Defunding the financial markets through an iterative tax can provide a blueprint for building a post-capitalist world. So how much money could be raised? The value of, it's important to understand the value that we're putting forward today in terms of how it relates to global GDP, gross domestic product, the value of economies around the world. which today is around 250 billion pounds per day, the value of total economy's output. The value of global capital flowing through financial markets, so this middle column here, is actually 28 trillion pounds per day. That 28 trillion pounds per day comes from both exchanges, like the London Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, but it also comes from the over-the-counter trading done by the world's biggest investment banks, whose wealth can be traced directly back to enslavement and colonialism. The tax could easily raise, just by applying a 0.05% tax rate. Don't forget, VAT is charged at 20%. So if we just charge a 0.05% tax rate, we're looking at 14 billion pounds per day to fund reparations and systems change. I've estimated how much that could be in the UK, which is around 500 million pounds per day. That's over 100 billion pounds per annum. And actually, these figures, I said, includes exchange traded and over-the-counter markets. They also include the major asset classes traded across all financial markets, including equities, bonds, foreign exchange currencies, and commodities markets. And commodities markets are also large. That's where oil and gas is traded. Oil and gas that's plundered. Metals that are plundered get traded through the commodities markets. And also, with the rise of financialization that's been talked about for the last 2 days, most of financial markets trading is increasingly on paper without the need for these physical assets, but are still leveraging these physical assets. And those physical assets need to be reclaimed as part of this reparations agenda, and they can be through the tax. This number actually even doesn't include the world's gold and silver exchange, which, believe it or not, is based in London, as they do not publish transparent data. So the world is far from poor, as we've just seen. 17% of the world's adults are in Europe and North America, and each hold, on average, $237,000. The rest of the world's share of adults, 83%, each hold just $36,000. Even that number is heavily skewed towards a minority of city workers in the global south. But under capitalism, there is no convergence of levels of wealth, because the global north and the global south, there's no convergence of levels of wealth between the global north and the south, only greater concentrations of inequality. That's because investment in capital assets relies on a capitalist class owning the means of production and a class of workers to be paid wages, the framework for which has been laid down for 500 years. Capital investments made by colonial states means levels of capital accumulation and concentration of power are in place unless the ownership of assets are dismantled, reallocated, and held by the public. Reparations should aim to assess ways in which the pillars of imperialism, including the industrial military complex, monarchies, parliaments, aristocracies, judiciaries, patent office, and all public and industry sectors, including the finance sector, the fossil fuel sector, the pharmaceutical sector, etc., are decolonized, chiefly abolishing the underlying profit motive and taking back public ownership of ill-gotten lands, resources, and assets. In conclusion, the wealth, industry, economy, and power of enslavers and colonizers is intrinsically linked to 500 years of imperialism. And the financial markets provide the best indicator of the present value of the spoils of enslavement and colonialism. An iterative tax and combined with the revolutionary potential of it, built through a movement of movements on financial markets, provides an efficient means of transfer to people who deserve economic justice for the present day consequences of enslavement and who live with structural inequalities which have persisted for centuries. The tax over the longer term enables the transformation of global power relations and the dismantling of imperial capitalism that maintains poverty, inequalities, and ecocide. Liberal campaigns for a financial transaction tax to date have not critically engaged with the financial market's intrinsic relationship with these issues, let alone imperialism. Those who want to be allies with the decolonization and reparations movements, such as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, ISMA, must be willing to speak of Western-backed regime changes, the corporate impunity of multinationals with militia armies, and the Western industrial military complex itself that exists to serve and protect capitalism, not people. Recalibrating the FTT in this way has the potential to achieve the social, cultural, economic, and environmental justice that is often spoken by liberal campaigners and political advocates, but are nowhere near being materialized. I'll end it on that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Keval. If you can unshare your screen, thank you, lovely. We're going to move on to hear from Priya Lukka now, who's an economist in international development and a reparations specialist. She's had a lot to do with thinking and writing about the roles of big international organisations like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and what a reparations approach might mean for them. Priya, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. What an esteemed panel to be the last person on. Thank you, Naomi, and thank you to all the other panelists. Always great to hear all of you speak. So I think that I wanted to just sort of offer some reflections on what everyone said, and just firstly to say that my work as an economist is really to support the work that Esther is doing, that Peter's doing, that Keval's doing. So I'm trying to use my skills as an economist really to support different ways in which we can really find a way of making reparations work in practice in different contexts. But for that to happen, it needs, it needs different things at different levels. And I think that, part of what's been my journey as an economist has been really to find how I can re-envision economics in a way in the spirit of the reparations movement. So it's been a really illuminating kind of process for me as well, to kind of really feel very firm and secure in rejecting the neoliberal constructs in which I was taught and schooled, and feel very committed to a decolonial sort of journey ahead, and to support that with really robust analysis, with really good solid politics that underpins it all, and really a kind of sense of this is what the international solidarity agenda is about. But we've been taught to think very much in terms of nation states and their comparison, as Gurminder said earlier when she was talking about Piketty's work. So like I think for me, I've been working for the last 7 or 8 years in international development. And what I've really realized is that politics of global poverty are wrapped up in the need for systems change, and racial inequity needs to be challenged because that's hardwired into the current setup. And therefore the kind of really big hitting social justice pieces of work that we all target and work on, debt, climate change, tax, all of those things can't really be worked on or tackled without much more far-reaching strategies for transformation. So that's the conclusion I have arrived at after several years of working in the sector itself. And why I was really drawn to reparations as a kind of complete, like, kind of like when someone kind of tells you, you've got a completely new construct to examine the global economy. For me, suddenly, this was a really powerful way to challenge dominant institutions and their orthodoxies. So I think that I wanted to mention that because I think in the post-COVID realization, we can clearly see now all over the world, Black and brown people and other ethnic groups have higher rates of poor outcomes across health, social and economic dimensions. And there's a lot of data to validate this as well. So it's easier, I would say now, or there's a more open kind of debate related sort of environment to see that, you know, to say things like race is a driver of poverty. And I say that because it's built from my own consideration of racial and ethnic stratification in different contexts. And that's helped me to build an important global picture of disadvantage in the overall context of colonial histories, racialized economic policies, and the ideologies of race. And so that's where my own research is situated. But I think that, you know, what's really key is, you know, what Esther started talking about when she introduced us to what reparations mean. And I think the starting place to recognize in any practical work or any best practice on reparations is that it's kind of really grounded in this recognition of colonialism, and colonialism has resulted in many forms of damage, economic, ecological, societal, political, and psychological, just to name a few. So that concept of reparations is firmly rooted in this idea of repair of that damage. And as Esther said, most reparations movements do not only call for monetary compensation, they focus on a more holistic form of justice, viewing the inequalities of the global economy as rooted in a continuum of this colonialism, and really recognizing that nobody is unequal alone. Extreme poverty exists alongside or is actually fueled by extreme wealth. Marginalization exists alongside power, and burden exists alongside privilege. So for me, bringing about reparations rests in using the frameworks for it and really rooting any work that's done in the institutions that are there and set up and kind of owned and developed by the movements themselves. So I think all of the movements and the organizations that Esther mentioned are really worth understanding and researching and kind of looking up, because often I think in the social justice space, we try and recreate things. We try and, you know, create like new campaigns, new initiatives, new bodies of research. Actually, the institutional basis for all of this work is very much rooted already and exists within the movement. And then I think there's, you know, the UN guiding principles, there's guidelines specifying restitution, compensation, satisfaction, guarantee of non-repetition that are all really important to understand. So that's kind of like my starting place. And I think that many commentators now, I mean, 2020 has been an incredible year for reparations discourse, and it's become really much more in the mainstream. So I think that, you know, there wouldn't have been a conference like this at the end of 2019. So it's brilliant to see all of us as a global community come together. But many commentators are now really saying more openly that the forces formerly used to control the colonized persist in the structures today. And that's not distant crimes of previous figures in history, but they're the genesis of our current global system, which sort of ensures that global economic growth is prioritized over the lives of those who are powerless, poorer, and invariably people of color. And I feel very uncomfortable even using the term poorer, because it's again using the lens of comparison that the system has led us to believe is the way that we kind of delineate communities. So I think within this, I think it's quite then natural to see why racial injustice is at the heart of the decolonization movement. And although many countries have gained political independence, many of the economic structures and processes and mechanisms that enabled colonial exploitation are still there. They're still leaving an enduring effect of discrimination, inequality, and poverty. So for me, reparations means not basing a kind of vision for the future in small adaptations to the new colonial structures. It means something much more hopeful and restorative, where all of us as parties come together and reflect and decide on how to live better together. So I think, you know, there's so much discourse on land redistribution, on climate reparations. So I think any social justice issue you take, I think if you apply the lens of reparations to it, you get a different outcome to how you might go about it if you're in a kind of traditional economic development setting. So I think that's really important to recognize as well. So economics as a, you know, as a tool is fairly kind of, you know, it's got kind of quite a mainstream, kind of quite conservative underpinnings in many ways. Development economics was kind of, you know, meant to maximize social welfare more and kind of really think about the most deprived, the most disenfranchised from the economic system. So if you think of reparations as much more further rooted in community interests, its lens of inquiry allows a much more transformational approach to be achieved and politically aspired to as well. So all the work that Esther said, all the work that Peter's referencing, this is like political change, economic change, monetary compensation as part of that as well, but it's far more broad ranging. And I think that reparations also really considers the connection and the rights of communities to the ecosystems they depend on for their livelihoods, nourishment, and their identity as well. So I won't go into too much detail about any of the kind of, you know, land redistribution or climate, but just to say that I think that they are the biggest examples today of kind of how you would apply a reparations kind of lens. And I think land is still really a critical issue in current development challenges, from a lack of rights to realise land use, to land being privatised in open bidding processes, as we're seeing all over the world right now. And again, across a backdrop of soaring demand for food, fuel, and other commodities, we're seeing like a real intensification of the pressure on land in what is largely unregulated spaces globally as well. And I think this is only set to increase. So I think, you know, the reparations or the reparative justice approach to land is key. And I think the same goes with climate. But the other side of my work is really to sort of look at global systems and institutions. And Naomi, as you said, I've been trying to do some analysis on, you know, what would a reparations approach mean for the global economic system? And I think that, you know, trying to kind of conceive of like development aid as fixing fundamental global inequalities, I think we've been sold a vision of kind of progress that could never get anywhere, could never really solve the structural and systemic problems that were a legacy and directly attributable to colonial eras. So I think that has to be the starting point. But I think also, you know, the institutions themselves are hardwired to promote the interests of the elite and the privileged. And I think that therefore, IFIs today really rely on indirect forms of influence rather than immediate control over government policy that colonial administrations had. But it's interesting because the objective is still largely the same: to create the right conditions for continued economic growth and accumulation of capital in already powerful countries. So therefore, I think, you know, for me, it's about kind of really trying to provoke and promote a really good dialogue with the institutions themselves around what a decolonial approach would look like, around what systems change means, around why some of these enduring issues of inequality are so systemic, and just going beyond the myth and the rhetoric of economic development that largely is the kind of framework or the narrative of today's societal progress and economic development progress as well. So I'll probably leave it there, just to say that, you know, it's been a great conference. And I think that hearing some of the sessions this afternoon that I was able to join, I think that for me, it really expands the kind of conceptual frameworks to some of these debates that we're progressing in our activist spaces. So it's really powerful to come together in this kind of way. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Priya. There's lots of questions coming in thick and fast, and I'm aware that we have very little time left to try and work our way through them. We've got some great questions, and I'm going to try to rattle a few of them off and incorporate some of them. We have a question I'd like to direct at Esther, if I may, and Priya, from Kojo Asari Bonsu, and the question is, how much does the return and restitution of our land from imperial and colonial rule and imposition return and restore our international legal personality, sovereignty and self-determination? And perhaps I can also roll in a couple of other questions there and ask you which particular areas of reparational justice give you the most hope currently? Thanks.
I'll make a start. The campaigning strategy and tactics of many different sections of the international social movement, in particular PARCO that I've mentioned, the Global African People's Parliament, Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, recognize that the struggle for reparatory justice is part of the continued struggle for African liberation. And that is also a struggle against the recolonization of Africa today. And a big part of it, in terms of restitution, even according to the UN framework, is restitution of land and our right to belong to that land and to have a homeland. So there are people like me who are of African heritage, born in the diaspora, who lack and what's referred to, as Kojo has said, an international legal personality and recognition in terms of political status as a, an African heritage community with national self-determination. So the struggle is about a struggle to also reclaim Africa, but not the Africa that it's there, the Africa that we want, and the Africa that movements on the ground are working to transform. This is not about us doing anything for people. It's about us working with our family and community members to actually reshape that landscape of Africa. And we actually envision that would be an Africa that would not maintain those European borders of colonization, that still separate African ethnicity and nationality from each other and are split across borders. Many of the conflicts and wars that we're seeing in Africa are largely, the causes are that. So we are working with communities who are creating what I've said are Sankofa-Homes, which are liberated zones that actually are Pan-African communities, okay? So it's very important. Now, for me, what gives me the most hope are these self-repair initiatives, because ultimately, as I've said, reparations must result in the transformation of a people, and people are their own liberators. And the struggle for African reparations is a very advanced struggle. We're very clear African reparationists. That's why I said we should recognize who the leaders have been, what the movements have been, what they've been articulating, because there's an attempt to erase a lot of that today, even in our own lifetimes. And those efforts continue to inspire those of us who come from other generations to continue passing on that baton. So the self-repair efforts, which are not just about us going in a little corner somewhere, it's actually tied to the various approaches to systemic change and structural change, okay? And Africa itself, the repaired Africa that we refer to as Ma'atu Buntuman, really cannot exist outside of, a repaired world. So that means all of humanity has to be catalyzed into that. And our work in relation to tackling the climate and ecological crisis very much focuses on that. And that was another question in terms of the sort of integral nature of what's referred to as planet repairs. So repairs to our, our planet, our environment, our earth, not just people-centered repairs, because we know that our planet is imperiled. And there'll be no reparations of any form on a planet that is being killed, essentially.
Thank you. Priya, did you want to respond to that?
Nothing further to add. Thanks, Naomi.
Okay. So yes, thank you for answering the question on that was one of the ones I was going to ask you next about the idea about climate. We have a question from Julian McClure. How important is land today in comparison with other forms of capital for programs of global reparative justice? Not sure who wants to take that one. Don't be shy.
Esther, do you want that? I'm happy to.
You can start. You can start.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
I do think land is absolutely vital. It's important both from an economic perspective because it's the basis on which wealth can be derived, but is also symbolic, as Esther has pointed out. But there are other forms of assets and material wealth that continue to create inequalities that would exist if they're not part of a reparations agenda. Financial assets being perhaps the second largest one, which is why I guess I'm quite interested in the financial transactions tax, not just because it's financial transactions on company shares, but also it goes or addresses the commodities that are being plundered and then traded on these world markets, and that, as I've outlined, totals 28 trillion pounds per day. And so I think it's land, it's financial and commodity assets, and I think that you could argue actually that things like inheritance wealth, personal wealth, through a reparations approach, then there needs to be obviously a dismantling of tax havenry, and from that tax haven we'll get to know how many hundreds of trillions is hidden in that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Keval. I'm working through the collection of questions. Another question from Julie McClure for Esther. In this conference, we've heard about how people around the world have been subjected to various forms of imperialism. Europe's global empires span the world, yet the imperial revenues from countries like India seldom appear in reparations debates. How can we balance the needs of different regions of the world for reparative justice when the impacts of imperialism were global?
That's a really great question, and I'll try and answer it. I think when I'm answering it, I'm thinking what comes to mind for me is a question that Malcolm X was once asked by a white person on what they can do, to support the struggle for Black liberation. And he said, go away and work in your own communities. That's what you can do, because when you work in your community, I work in mine, then we can kind of come together along that road. So it's important to recognize that part of the reason why there's so much focus on, say, Africa and the African diaspora around reparations is because it's a politicized agenda that our movements and communities have been championing for centuries in a very explicit way. So what we're seeing is actually some of the outcomes of that we've been able to influence and shape hearts and minds from even people outside of our own communities. So I did mention in my earlier comments about the ISMA being part of the PRIM, the People's Reparations International Movement. And I work with both Priya and Keval. And we have discussed, and actually I'm sure they can bear witness that we've said, part of what we see you as being important work that you have to help doing is to catalyze those movements, back home, wherever home is. And home is many different places. So it's about supporting those communities and movements, those voices to emerge. Many times they might not be using, and this is why we have to recognize cognitive justice, they might not be framing it as reparations, okay? They might have other terms. It might be about sovereignty, or it might be about something else. So we have to have a cognitive justice approach and recognize that communities who have been dispossessed have for centuries been engaging not in only in efforts to stop that harm of colonization, but to repair the damage. And I think it's about us finding out who they are, because they exist in their multitudes, and supporting the catalyzation of those communities to link struggles. And if we're not from those communities, it's about how do we show greater internationalist solidarity, which is about mutual liberation, okay, on this path to transforming the world through elevating our own movements of repair.
Thank you. That's a good moment for us to finish and to hand over for the closing remarks. Thank you to you all, Esther, Peter, Keval, Priya. I'll hand over now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thanks, Naomi, and all. I'm hoping that Gominda and Julia are around. Ah, there they are. Because I do really want to hand over to them as the originators of the idea for the book on which so much of this has been based, but also the catalyst for all the thinking. I've taken so much from these 2 days, and there's so much for us as the Tax Justice Network and the wider movement to think about and to work through how we act on all sorts of elements of this. But let me ask Gominda and Julia if I can, because and say thank you to both of you for making this happen, because it's been great. But I'm sure you have thoughts to share before we close.
Shall I start, Julia? Is that okay? Well, thank you to everybody on our behalf as well for participating over the 2 days. It's been a fantastic conversation, and all the work that colleagues have done to enable the 2 days to work so smoothly and so on. I found it absolutely fascinating. I thought the conversations have been incredibly wide-ranging. The talks have been really great, and it's been interesting to sort of think about how one's own thinking shifts as a consequence of listening to these papers and presentations and the conversations that's followed from them. I think for my own part, I just had a few closing thoughts that I would like to share, and it's partly thinking about this aspect of how we address the problems that we identify and how we move forward, because I think ultimately there is a sense that, for me at least, that contemporary inequalities that shape our world are consequent to colonial histories, and that the way to address these histories is really to address the inequalities that we identify in the present. And this requires attentiveness to historical processes and to sort of thinking about the ways in which there's been a reproduction of social, political, and economic structures. And so in that sense, for my own part, I don't particularly find it helpful to focus on identities in this context, but rather think about how we need to work collaboratively and collectively to understand anew the sort of the ways in which the past has produced us and what work we need to do to transform it by addressing the problems that we identify in the present. And partly just in relation to this conversation about reparations, one of the things that I would say is that the British Empire was a global empire, and there's been a lot of work that's been done by various communities to address the inequalities that have been produced by the British Empire and think about how that has continued to shape the world. And what I find slightly frustrating in some of the ways in which the issues get taken up is the way in which they come to be disaggregated from each other as opposed to connected with each other. And whilst I think it's absolutely important that we address the history of the trade in human beings from West Africa to the Atlantic and across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the southern states of the US, I think it's important also to acknowledge that this occurs at the same time as the trade in human beings is being carried out both from the east coast of Africa, but also across the Indian Ocean world. And that when the Slavery Abolition Act is passed in Britain in 1833, it only abolishes the trade in human beings from the west coast of Africa to the across the Atlantic. It does not abolish the trade in human beings across the Indian Ocean world. That's allowed to continue. And indeed, the whole system is then replaced by a system of indenture, which is different really in name, not in substance, to the system of enslavement. So I find it odd that we disaggregate these processes, don't think about them as connected, because they were connected, at the very least at the top, by the men, and they were largely men who ran the various trading companies that transported human beings. And the system of colonial plantation economy is again a system that exists across the world. It doesn't exist only in one part of the world. And so I think we need to look at these historical processes. We need to think about the social structures that have been produced as a consequence of them, the ways in which these maintain and exacerbate inequalities in the present, and work together to address these issues. And I think this has been a fantastic space to raise a lot of these issues and questions. And I really hope that there'll be the possibility to sort of work together over the longer durée to continue to tackle the urgency of the politics that has been presented here today. So I'll pass on to Julia. I don't know, would you like to?
I don't want to add too much more. I know that we're on time and it's the end of a sort of a long, dark week. But just to say thanks again to the organisers who have made this happen, Helena and Naomi, and also Alex, for really putting on a fantastic conference here today. And I think that I myself have learned an awful lot from having these kind of juxtapositions of these different papers put together. And I always think it's important. I think we've kind of realised this importance of knowing that inequality is an historical product, and that also our notions of morality and legitimacy also need to be sort of decolonised as historical products as well. And I think that's kind of been something interesting to think about in this conference, but also with having this interdisciplinary framework and working with activists and practitioners. What's interesting for me, and I'm sure for others, is to kind of learn and think about what questions it is that we should be asking of our own research in different fields. And so that's something that I think I'm going to take away from this event. So as Gominda said as well, I hope that this is the start of productive conversations, and hopefully we'll find the right platforms to continue these dialogues. So thank you very much to everyone who's given up time to participate today. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia and Gominda. And let me just finish by thanking everyone who's taken part. It's really been fantastic. Occasionally you go to a conference or turn up online and it's about doing the bit that you're doing and then running away. And it just hasn't felt like that. There's been such energy and engagement. And, you know, I've stuck to every minute of this, even when I haven't been on screen. And, you know, just from the numbers, you can see a lot of people have too. I need to thank some of the people who haven't been on screen though. So apart from all the presenters and the panelists and speakers and the moderators, Sinead and Helena have been outstanding in actually making this whole thing happen, and you haven't seen them at all. So I really want to thank them. And in that, I'm reminded that they are also engaged in putting on our Climate Justice and Transition Conference, which is Thursday and Friday next week. So I would encourage you all to sign up for that too, because of course there's a question of climate reparations that joins this all together, and how we pay for everything is not unrelated to tax. But recognizing we're running 4 minutes over, and I think that's the worst we've done on anything in this whole conference, let me end there and say thank you finally to everyone who's joined us. I hope these discussions continue over the months and years ahead with both urgency and depth that they deserve. Thank you. Goodbye.